On today's episode, we're breaking down 6 levers that drive profitability across all client engagements, whether you run fixed fee projects, retainers, or long-term service programs. We'll also fold in core principles around gross margins, utilization, forecasting, and delivery discipline to show how they all reinforce each other.
All right, Sei-Wook. So this topic is very top of mind for us these days. And in our Barrel Holdings portfolio, we've had a pretty good year in the aggregate. But one of our portfolio companies, agency, is going through some challenges with profitability. And we've been thinking a lot about how they can kind of course correct. So this is an opportune time to dive into some of the fundamentals and see how we're thinking about it, and also just share some of the things that we're already doing or plan to do to make sure our agency gets back on track. So maybe we could kick it off by talking about a very important concept, gross margin. So maybe we can dive into that.
Yeah, definitely. So when we talk about margin today, it's about gross margin. Gross margin is the revenue that you receive as a company minus the cost of delivery, so the labor to service that revenue. And really, that metric is an indicator of how efficiently you're doing the work and getting the work done.
Yeah, in many respects, like people talk about profit, and this is one form of profit, right?
Yeah.
When we think about like where does gross margin, and you talk about ways to is like where does it get compressed or where does it leak? What do you think the 3 sources that we typically come across are?
Yeah, it usually starts at the pricing and scoping stage. So if there's misalignment there, right at the beginning of signing a new engagement, that's where a lot of, it's kind of the saying like you're setting up the team to fail from the get-go. The next part is poor utilization or overstaffing. So if you have way too many team members for the amount of work that you have. And then the third is inefficient delivery. So you may have scope things, you may have the right amount of people, but if you're not delivering consistently, so let's say your projects are going way over timeline wise from what you expect. So it's all about the delivery there.
Yeah, like how you're doing the projects or the engagements, right? Cool. We'll dive into each one of those, and we've split those into actually 6 separate levers. And so we will dive into those in a second. And I think we should note that this is profitability not just on kind of fixed fee projects, but it applies to retainers, any kind of hybrid models. And you can apply these principles across the board because at the end of the day, you're talking about the work that you need to do for your clients, the people involved, the promises you're making, and then how you're deliver it. So we think that these are pretty transferable. So let's dive in. Let's start with lever number 1. You want to kick it off?
Yeah, so lever number 1 is pricing and scoping. So like I just mentioned, it's really aligning what you are delivering or promising that you'll deliver to the price that you're charging for it. And in general, like the more you can charge for a project gives you just more buffer. Like you have more buffer for expenses. If things go sideways, if there are delays, you have a little bit more buffer. And then if the team makes mistakes along the way, you just have a little bit more buffer. So the more you can charge for a project helps with the margin.
Yeah, that's a very loaded topic, right? Because what's stopping anyone from saying, okay, like if if you want more profitability, just jack up your prices, charge a client more. Why is that not always the solution to this?
I mean, it's funny because one of our like earlier interns said, "Hey, the solve for this problem, why don't you just increase your prices?" And there's definitely truth to that, but you're missing there is, yeah, if you increase your prices, clients may just go somewhere else where the prices are lower. And they'll say, I don't want to pay what you're asking for. So you may end up in a situation where you end up losing a lot of projects because you're trying to ask for more and more money.
Yeah, and this is a topic we'll definitely cover in a later episode, but there's so much that goes into pricing. That's part of it is how you're positioned. Part of it is the psychology of how you're talking about the value you're bringing to the client. And then also just like what the market conditions are like to support the pricing that you put forward. But all that aside, higher pricing is better. That gives you a buffer. And then, yeah, how does that relate to the scoping side?
Yeah. So basically, the pricing is the pricing, but really you need to match the scope to the fee that you're charging and be clear about what it is that you're promising to do. And we'll touch more upon this in some of the other levers. But if you don't have alignment from the get-go, then that's quickly a way that you can lose margin when it's not clear what you're delivering.
Yeah. One thing maybe a good example of like how we think about it across our agency sometimes is if there's a price that you've had the kind of conversations with the client and, let's say they're going to buy a web project or a retainer, like a 6-month retainer for 100K, $100,000, right? And, a good way to start is actually to think about your desired gross margin on it first. So you might think, okay, let's aim for 70%. Okay. So we want basically the cost of delivery to be 30%, 30K, and so that we get 70K of gross margin. So the way to think about scoping is, hey, can we get this work done for 30K of cost? And that I think is a helpful approach to like really structure the thinking around scope. And I think that's what mean by like matching the fee, right? Scope matching the fee is sometimes you got to know, hey, like where, depending on the agency and your situation, the gross margins might be less, might be more. And so you kind of have to apply it to your situation. But generally, that's what we are talking about.
Yeah, and important thing there is typically you're trying to price based on the outcome of the work, not necessarily like you're going to buy X amount of hours that translates to 100K. So with that lens, you can really be creative on how do we do or design the project to achieve that? Do we need to use the exact same process that we did on the other project or retainer where it was, the budget was double? Or do you need to use the same type of resources? Maybe you can change the combination of senior and junior, or potentially some offshore resources to help achieve the same outcome with the budget that you have.
Yeah. Speaking of which, that is lever number 2, which is staffing and utilization. So let's dig into that and how that impacts profitability.
Yeah, this kind of can also go more macro. So just thinking about your whole team, all the roles, and what is their billable expectation. So a senior person who oversees a team member may have a lower billable expectation versus a more junior team member that's fully dedicated to working on client work. So I think, yeah, at the get-go, just understand that each role is slightly different. And then tracking it consistently, doing utilization reports and actually taking a look at the numbers to see where people's time is going. Because when you look at overall gross margin at a company, idle hours where someone has zero billability really crushes your margin really quickly.
Yeah. And I know we across our agencies prefer to track time, but just for those that might push back, like, hey, we as an agency absolutely, don't track time, have no plans to track time in the future. What would you say to those folks in terms of tracking things like utilization? I mean, I think it's still possible. So maybe, how do we go about that in that situation?
Yeah, the other kind of way to look at it is what's the planned or the expected utilization of a person. So that's kind of the exercise of going through and forecasting what everybody should be working on and updating that on an ongoing basis to know that if a project gets delayed, you got to increase the expected amount of time or percentage of allocation, however you prefer to do it, saying, all right, maybe this person is working 25% on this project, 50% on this project, and having some like semblance of how the time is being spent. So the person doesn't need to track time, but through another measure where their time and allocation is going.
Yeah. So basically some sense of like how people are spending time is better than nothing. Great. And then just alluding back to what you said about just the type of people on a project, seniority levels especially. Can I expand on that?
Yeah, a couple things there is if you may want to have like senior people working on a client account, but obviously they're the most expensive resources on your team. And then if you have only junior people working on an account, you may realize that, hey, we got to do a bunch of rework. Like there are things that a senior person would take 10 hours and a junior person will take 40 hours. So like suddenly the margin there is lost. So it's really a balance of like, how do you support junior resources with senior resources and making sure that it's the right alignment so that a project does go efficiently and you're not reworking a lot of the project or engagement. But also kind of the mix is thinking about full-time versus contract or part-time resources. So especially when work comes in peaks and valleys. So you might have a really busy season or really busy period of time, or, one of your clients say needs help for a short period of time, using contractors to scale up versus full-time resources to scale up so that at the least you can utilize your full-time resources 100% and then use the contractors to flex up and down as needed.
Yeah, we've experienced this ourselves and we hear it so many times. Like as an agency, you might be super profitable on a retainer or project basis, but then as a whole, because let's say you did a project in perfect time, maybe even a bit earlier. You did everything you needed to do, huge margins if you measure it on that project basis. But then the week after that wrapped up, or the 2 weeks after it wrapped up, you had a bunch of people who weren't working on anything, and you're still paying them out a full-time salary. And when you look back on it a month later, you're like, wow, that wasn't that profitable at all. And so I think that's where
Yeah.
the utilization concept really comes into focus is, yeah, you have to keep that realization high. Obviously, yeah, the freelancers allow you to kind of immediately flex down after a project is done so that, yeah, you're not carrying those costs when people aren't busy.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Cool.
Lever 3, this one, engagement design and approach. Just this is how projects are done or engagements are handled. And one of the things that are really kind of profitability killers when like you don't have a good plan. You don't have a good process structure of like how you're going to get it done. And so there's a lot of unnecessary meetings. There's a lot of just kind of back and forth, and that kind of eats stuff up, eats time up. And this is not too uncommon for agencies that are doing something for the first time, let's say. So it's like, hey, we've never done this type of project before, but it looks exciting. We're going to dive into it. And then you got to figure out how to do it. You got to build a plane while you're flying it, right? And so there's a lot of waste that happens in those situations, which sometimes is okay. It's an investment, and maybe you try to do a similar project later and learn from that. But this is where, yeah, the engagement design approach is super important. Maybe we could speak to kind of like, what are some ways to be smart about engagement design and approach?
Yeah, I think where possible, it's like don't reinvent the wheel for things that are the same every single time. Like how you onboard your project team, how you onboard your client, how you think about QA and like making sure that you're allocating the time for it. I think one of the big things in the design of like an engagement is like create the project schedule all the way through and really think about how you're going to get that engagement done, including what are the meetings? Like, do you need a meeting? Right? Or can it just be like a post or an email or some kind of async communication? Do you need client feedback? Have you budgeted for that time? And if that's downtime for your team, could your team then be working on something else? And then just thinking about like all of the nitty gritty aspects of a project from start to finish and accounting for it as much as possible, because then like at least there's going to be some variation, but there is some predictability to how the project's going to get done and how you want it
Yeah.
to get done. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And I can't not talk about this because it's such a pet peeve of mine and it just drove me nuts. But like the project, schedule or project plan. A lot of times, like the thing that I would hate to see is like when, sometimes project managers, account managers, whoever is creating it, they're so focused on it being perfect and like super detailed that it just never gets done. And in some ways it's an incomplete picture. And, to that I say like, look, what's more important is just first get a basic sense of the shape of a project, like, from start to finish. You don't have to have it perfect. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Just fill it in so that everyone has a sense of like, hey, look, over the next 4 months, 5 months, these are the things that are going to happen. And this is the launch date, and then work backwards. But what happens a lot of times is they're trying to meticulously plan every single week and then getting more inputs. And then because of that, it's an open-ended launch date. And by the time they finish adding everything, you realize, wow, this is 2 months, 3 months longer than we had talked to the client about. And the big thing is, start with the end in mind. And then also just don't sweat the details until you've kind of gotten the structure and the container done. And then from there, you got some constraints to work with to solve the problem out. So that's my rant on.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. It's almost like start with the end, work backwards. What are the big milestones? And then like, how do you get to those big milestones? Right. And then, it's kind of the analogy of like building the plane as you're flying it. Like there's some things that you'll need to figure out and like the next week might be the most clear. But as long as like, hey, we got a big deadline in 2 weeks, how do we get there and make sure that we're hitting those major milestones is important.
Yeah, definitely. And then anything else on the like design and approach side of these engagements to kind of improving or increase profitability?
The other thing is just thinking about what does our team need to do versus what the client's team need to do in an engagement. And sometimes if it's not clear, you may just end up taking on work that you didn't need to. Like maybe the client could have gone in and populated a bunch of content on the site or gone through and done some kind of UAT testing that you weren't clear about upfront. So you just think through, it's not just a one-sided thing when you're working through an engagement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Thanks for listening to Agency Habits Podcast. A quick heads up, Barrel Holdings is acquiring agencies. We look for profitable firms with durable revenue and strong teams. If you're thinking about succession, de-risking, or scaling with a partner, visit barrel-holdings.com to see our buy box and set up a confidential call. Thanks. Let's move on to level 4. So scope management and change orders. Let's talk about this because this has to do with scope creep, which is in many ways one of the biggest threats to profitability.
Yeah. So we talked about scoping, right? I think that was the first lever. And that's honestly like scope management starts there at the biz dev stage when you create an SOW, you agree on a scope. And the more you can be specific about like deliverables, like rounds of revisions, like who does what in the user acceptance phase. If all of that it isn't outlined, it gives your team very little to push back on because it's very open-ended. But as long as those aspects are clearly documented, exactly what's being done, and if something is clearly out of scope, really going through and having a formal process to document how to handle those situations.
Yeah, I'd say vague scopes are one of the biggest liabilities when it comes to profitability because you can get taken for a ride as an agency if you're super vague about what you're actually delivering. So no, 100% there. But let's say you've written a tight scope and then the client is definitely asking for more. What are some ways to kind of handle that?
Yeah, it's sometimes an art to figuring out how to navigate that. So let's say a request comes in, and you'll say, hey, let's do this in the second phase. We'll defer this to the future. And that might be an acceptable solution for now. Or there can be a trade-off saying, this thing that you wanted, maybe that's not important. And this new request that's come in, maybe this should take priority. So why don't we like trade those? We'll do this new thing and we won't do this other thing. And then there's no change in budget, but there's a change in kind of the scope of what we're doing. Right. And then the third option is obviously just scope it out, ask for more money, and get more budget for the change that's about to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like you said, there it is an art because you have to understand and just like put ourselves in that position of like being buyers of anything, right? Like we expected to pay a certain price and maybe some things weren't clear. So we're just asking for this thing that we thought was part of it. And then for us to just immediately get hit with a change order won't feel good. Like, hey, you got to pay more. But then if there's a conversation around it, maybe an understanding, then, you're going to feel better. So I think it is definitely an art. I know you don't want to get into a situation where the client, I think the phrase is stop nickeling and diming me or just because then you're just jeopardizing kind of the health of that relationship in the long run.
The other thing, an exercise along with change management is let's say you are doing that trade-off, doing a $0 change order. So like documenting it, signing the scope, getting it in writing, and making sure the client understands that this is what's happening. And it's like signing a new contract for it, but it's just a $0 agreement.
And that goes back to documentation because like over the course of a project, you could have dozens, if not hundreds of these kind of scope conversations. And if you don't have a paper trail, people's memories get very hazy over time and they might come back and be like, hey, I thought you said you would do this. And if you can't point to something, oh man, those are tough combos to have later on.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. Anything on the retainer front, actually? Because like I know that is very project focused on that front, but like when it comes to scope and change orders on the retainers front, anything there?
Yeah, I think with the retainers, somewhat depends on how you've structured it, but typically you want to go through a prioritization exercise to understand this is what we're going to do with the team that we've allocated to working on it. And it's the same kind of thing. When we think about a retainer, it's like a series of like, imagine like small little projects that make up a retainer. So if you continue to agree to things because maybe there isn't an explicit scope, then that'll balloon the team that was supposed to work on it. Suddenly, if they're supposed to balance another account, maybe they're not able to do that. So it's the same exercise, just really agreeing on what the priorities are and documenting that clearly.
Yeah, maybe the other element is like kind of carving out some time or, resources for ad hoc requests because sometimes retainers are a catch-all for some of these things. And so if you have for example, that like, there's going to be a certain amount of ad hoc stuff that comes up. Client's going to ping you and be like, hey, can you take care of this? And you want the retainer to kind of service them in that fashion. Like that is something to pre-plan for. And then just like sometimes like certain projects or certain requests are just too big for just to kind of do comfortably in a retainer. So it's even better to just be like, hey, let's treat this one as a one-off project and then preserve the retainer for some of these other things that are more ongoing. Lever 5. So we have reusable components and IP. So let's dive into that one.
Yeah, so this is similar to what we were talking about with how you're going to do execute a project. And oftentimes, the more you do similar engagements, you internally develop standardized templates on documentation. From a coding standpoint, there might be modules and scripts that you've kind of written that you could use again. And just thinking about what are those reusable components in a project that could reduce the delivery cost. And yeah, it could be like a reporting framework. So let's say you're doing the same kind of report every single time, having the same structure, the same PowerPoint keynote pitch template that you could use that every subsequent team benefits from. All of that definitely can help reduce the time and cost of delivery.
Yeah, absolutely. And once you have these reusable components and then also documentation on how to use them, you can then assign kind of lower cost team members, more junior team members, or you can, kind of rely on offshore, nearshore resources to handle more of these, freeing up
Yeah.
time for the more senior folks to kind of do higher value work. And so it just creates a really great sense of leverage. And that way, I think this is where we've talked a lot about specialization and kind of being focused in who you serve and what you do for them. And this is a key way it plays out is over time, you have all of these like components, IP, and you're able to just come to the table and engagement with like, hey, this is how we do it. These are all the tools and kind of internal kind of workflows that we have in place, and we're able to do it super efficiently for you. And maybe you could charge a lot because the certainty of the quality of it, everything is great. But at the same time, the cost to do it is low and the margins are super high. So you're able to book a lot of profits from it. So this is kind of, a huge part of why we kind of beat the drum on specialization.
Yeah. One thing for this is you do need to be intentional about setting aside time because oftentimes it's internal or unbillable time that's being spent to organize all the components. So it's good for all the little pockets of time that the team has, like in between a project or downtime within a project or an engagement where the team has the ability to say, all right, here's everything we did. Let's package it up cleanly so that other team members can benefit from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more habitual you can make it and just make it like, hey, the post close of a project immediately has some time built in, pre-built in, the more likely these things are going to get built out.
Yeah.
All right. The last lever, we saved the one that everyone's talking about for last, but it's automations and AI. So yeah, this is something that is top of mind for a lot of folks. But yeah, let's talk about the case of engagement profitability. How does this lever factor?
Yeah, this is all in the service of how could you be more efficient at executing a project? And automations can help with a lot of the like administrative tasks, like low level tasks that happen in a project. As one example, you can think of an automation as a contract gets signed and you use DocuSign. Can you trigger something in HubSpot or the other way? HubSpot gets updated as the project is signed, and then it triggers something in Bill.com that says, now you can send the invoice. And at the same time, that says, let's activate a project. So Google Drive gets created, Harvest gets set up. It's not like there are all these tools where typically someone would manually go through and create these things. But if there could be an automation that helps all of these steps that are exactly the same in every single engagement, that kind of stuff can help save hours of time for a manager, for example. Yeah.
And even like enriching it with AI so that as these workflows are happening, there's a brief for the engagement or some kind of research that gets automatically pre-populated and is ready to onboard the team.
Yeah.
And it might draw from call transcripts that you have from your video calls or just going out there and like hitting up all the client sites and look at the competitors and then kind of tying it neatly so that, yeah, that could save hours. And that's
Yeah.
something that is very real. And I think people are experimenting with it. I mean, we're certainly using it in a big way.
That's more on the administrative side. But even on the execution of, the work, the engagements, thinking about especially on development, yes, AI has helped speed up a lot of development tasks when you can help prompt to get scripts or things off the ground, even on the QA testing side, automatically generating tickets for the team and seeing ways that AI can supplement there. On like the design side, there could be time spent on like initial copy that you have to write for a website. The AI, if you prompt it, the copy that comes out of it could be pretty good or close to production ready. So there's a lot of like aspects of the journey that can be supplemented by AI.
Yeah, supplemented or even kind of taken up as a whole, right? Like it's just like, hey, you can put in prompts like, hey, I'm looking to get a website made that has these qualities, if you could describe it right. And then sometimes it could one shot it to a 70% good enough site, then which then can be polished up and tweaked and delivered to clients. So yeah, it is there's a lot of stuff that on a weekly, monthly basis keeps kind of eating up more of the stuff that was manual. And at the same time, I don't think that necessarily kind of makes it any easier to some degree because you still got to manage it, right? You still have clients. You have to make sure, understand what you're bringing to the table and like get their buy-in on certain things. And so there's a whole aspect to the engagements that AI is not going to completely take over. I just feel like as long as it's people working with people, there's going to be an element of management there. But yeah, I think as an agency leader, you'd be foolish not to embrace these tools because at the end of the day, I think a vast majority of folks are leveraging them in some capacity. All right, let's bring it all together. I mean, we are the Agency Habits podcast, so maybe we can talk about some habits that can reinforce all these levers in a repeatable way. So maybe we can quickly list off these habits.
Yeah. First habit, weekly budget tracking. So every project should have or engagement should have a budget that is looked at and monitored weekly. And oftentimes this is the project manager, account manager, whoever the role is at the company. And what we found is it's almost helpful to have some shared accountability. So you do it as a team, look at your budgets together and see how are we versus our estimated actual hours versus estimated and what opportunities do we have to course correct before we go too far.
Yep. Next one is forecasting and capacity planning. So making sure you're looking ahead and forecasting your team's hours before coming to the work. And then, yeah, definitely matching that pipeline with the available capacity. Because if you have an influx of work coming in, you're going to have to adjust the team size up. If there's kind of less work coming in, you might want to size that team down. And then we talked about the freelancer or some kind of a contractor bench to be able to flex up or down as needed without having to carry ongoing costs.
Yeah. And for that one, it could be team leads involved in that process, biz dev to inform what is coming down the pipeline, but obviously all the project managers, account managers who are working on live projects engagement. Cool. The third one is tight change control. So we talked a lot about change management, but having a formal process where all the changes are documented and avoid trying to do free work along the way that really hampers your profitability. And yeah, getting the team involved to flag that. So it could be a designer who's in a call with a client who brings up a new request, making sure there's a process for that person to talk to the right people to have a conversation around a change request.
Yeah, this is all about going back to scope management and just making sure we're handling that. Cool. And then the last habit is debriefs and feedback loops. I mean, we talk about this a lot, which is you have to learn and continue to, make improvements from the learnings. And so at the end of every engagement, you want to have a structured debrief, get your team together, just always have folks share what could have gone better and then just learn from those opportunities, double down on things that went well, and then also use the ones where you guys didn't do such a good job to create new processes, improve the way you do things the next time. And this is a great opportunity to dive into, especially where did margin kind of get lost or just how could we have preserved margin better. And yeah, once you kind of had that debrief, it's very important to then share it with the rest of the team so that others can learn from your experience. Okay, great. So that brings it all together. So 6 levers should kind of be a good framework to think about ways to clean things up on the profitability side. And then of course, these habits are ways to keep it in motion. Yeah. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, I think it's a whole team effort, as we've probably seen on gross margins and lifting profitability across the company. It's not just about one project, it's about a holistic view at all these different factors. And yeah, I think everyone has to come together and work together to achieve this goal.
Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in and good luck with making all your engagements profitable. Take care.
Thanks.